if we continue with the context in verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all mean the sexually immoral of this world, or the greed and the swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. So when we're talking about turning away from sin, the context is not necessarily that we're trying to move off into the wilderness where there's no sin at all, supposedly, forming our own ascetic communities, monasteries, and things like that where there's nobody around. He's not talking about isolation. What he's talking about in verse 11, and he just tells us, I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother. This is interesting because he's talking about this greater faith community, which includes Jews and Gentiles, and I believe it actually even includes the wider Jewish community who still lays hold of faith in God, even if they haven't yet laid hold of faith in Messiah yet. But he's talking about this faith community that worships God in sincerity and seeks to be righteous in God's eyes. Anyone who bears his name, if he's guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, no, not even to eat with such a one. Interesting that he uses this metaphor of eating when we're talking about keeping the festival, right? And we already know that Passover is a festival of eating. So this is the context of this particular passage. Paul wants us, in closing, I believe, to first and foremost deal with the evil that's in our midst, deal with the evildoers, deal with the sinners, deal with those who are unrepentant, deal with those who are not seeking to reconcile to the greater group. If that's your stance and you want to keep your sin, but you want to also keep your seat in the congregation, Paul says not so. It's not going to happen. You need to make a choice. Either get out or get right, right? Get right or get out. And so that's what Paul wants us to do as a community. We've got to deal with those particular people. And at the same time, Paul is letting us know, hey, we've got a festival. We've got the opportunity to walk into God's festivals year after year on a calendar level. These are real life community times in which we can come together, meet together, celebrate God's goodness, remember what He's done for us in times past. This, of course, is our celebration of Passover. We can also tie in the historical, by this point in time, the historical reality that Yeshua has already celebrated his Last Supper with his disciples, and that by this point in time, the first century disciples of the disciples and followers of Yeshua, the first and second and third generations and things like that, they already were imitating what Messiah had already done and forming mini Seders, which I believe formed the background behind our later communion services, which I think is okay. Communion, in my opinion, is a mini Passover Seder. It's just a smaller, scaled-down version. And so I'm not too harsh on Christians who say, well, I don't keep Passover, and then I just turn around and ask them, do you keep communion? And if they say yes, which most Christians do, then I say, well, bravo, right? I applaud them. You're actually, without knowing it, in my understanding, keeping a mini Passover Seder because you're imitating what Messiah did on his last Passover Seder. You're simply overlapping the larger Passover ceremony with the smaller communion ceremony that Yeshua did. The two of those are overlapped in that final Seder ceremony that Yeshua performed for us, where he fused the existing Passover elements, the bread and the wine, with the spiritual realities, namely his blood and his body. So if you're keeping communion, then my understanding is that you're basically keeping a mini Passover Seder, or Passover light, if you want to call it that. So in closing, for tonight's commentary, we didn't really have this live open mic discussion like I had originally planned, and I think that was per the request of the live participants. They felt that maybe this wouldn't be the time. Maybe later, maybe someday we'll have when the time is conducive and the opportunity affords itself, we'll have a live open class. But for now, I hope that this particular commentary has been informative for us, particularly answering this question: should Christians celebrate Passover?